Hello, everyone. Welcome back. In the interest of time, we're just going to press on quite quickly. So next up is a panel of four. Each panelist will have 10 minutes to speak, and then we'll have a bit of time for questions. So if you do put your questions in the Q&A, I will read them out at the end. So this panel is talking about effective utilization of sustainability and heritage studies, and we're going to kick off first with Alison Heritage from ICROM. So hello, and I just unmute you, and you should already have your presenter's thought.
Thank you very much indeed. Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. Okay, yeah, just to bring up the slide. Okay. Yes, so just to start this panel discussion off, I thought I would just put out a few thoughts, principally centering around the topic of well-being. And I think really, what we're essentially talking today about, and particularly in this panel, which is about effective utilization of sustainability and heritage studies. We're really talking about research impact here, and why perhaps there might be some problems as to why we're not having enough research impact within the heritage sector. And I think it's interesting, listening today. It's been very interesting listening to the presentation so far. There's a lot of different approaches, which is in the very nature of research. However, I think the inherent problem with that as well, then, especially probably when you're sitting at decision-making level, for example, in government, is that you end up with a rather fragmented research effort if things are being done in different ways, and essentially somewhat fragmented messaging as a result of that. And I can totally say, I work for ICROM, which is an intergovernmental organization. We serve 137 member states worldwide. And the real problem with discussions of this sort really is that it's very difficult to make comparisons, and it's very difficult to get any kind of an aggregated overview in order to have really clear and very strong messaging. I think also when we're talking about sustainability, again, there's a certain fragmentation that we see in that there's quite a lot of work and discussion going on in terms of making the connections with economic sustainability. And also when we talk about sustainability, very often it is typically understood either in terms of economic sustainability and environmental sustainability. But there's sort of almost this missing persons element, which was also touched on this morning, which is that of the social sustainability, because you can't really have economic sustainability and environmental sustainability, I would argue, without social sustainability. The three have to come together. And it's really also, in a way, I think what is needed is a more people-centered approach to this whole debate. And in particular, obviously, we talk about this a lot. It's a sort of the holy grail is to have a common basic framework, a framework which is people-centered, a framework in a sort of common language as well. There's been some interesting comments about that, I think already, about the need for improved language within heritage research that is more understandable. I think we need frameworks of looking at the issues of sustainability that are certainly more adaptable to context, but also more, in a way, recognizable, meaningful not just to researchers, but also, dare I say it, to the public and also to decision makers. So we're really talking about how do we structure the way in which we go about undertaking our studies in a way that also allows cross-comparison, but again is unique. It's like my zebra is not the same as your zebra, but you can see they somehow blend. And at the same time, speaks to people. And so this is why really I wanted to explore today a little bit with you the idea of well-being, not as an alternative to sustainability, but in a way, the kind of a way of encapsulating sustainability. I think it's a very useful concept. For a start, it's a word that has resonance. I know, for example, if I talk to my mum or my my cousins about well-being, they'll understand what it's about, that it somehow is about people, it's something for them. Whereas if we tend to talk about sustainability or sustainable development, I think this is language that maybe isn't quite as accessible. On the other hand, I think there's a general, how to say, impression of well-being as a somewhat fluffy term, but it really isn't, and it's something worth taking seriously. And I hope I can outline why. First of all, I would say actually well-being, it's very interesting. If you look in the national constitutions and acts across the world, well-being is actually cited as a goal of nations in no fewer than 114 countries. So obviously it has a certain degree of political relevance. Also looking at this map, it's quite interesting to note it's not just a kind of Western developed economies priority, it's pretty much worldwide. I think another interesting thing about well-being is that it really comes with very strong philosophical and economic foundations. It has good pedigree. And just briefly to highlight one of the, I think, most important thinkers in this area, being Amartya Sen, who back in the 80s put forward the capabilities approach to well-being. And it's very nicely, I think, encapsulated in this statement of his, which is it being the expansion of the capabilities of persons to lead lives of value, to lead the kinds of lives they value and have reason to value. And it's interesting, within that one statement, we're really encapsulating both, this direct connection between the individual and the collective, and this notion really of measuring development in terms of really what matters to people. So this is very much fitting with the beyond GDP movement. And he defines also capability as being a set of valuable beings and doings, like being in good health or having loving relationships to which people have real access. And this notion of access is really, there's a very lovely analogy that was raised by Sen. A bit like a capability is a bit like, it's a bit like riding a bicycle. It's like the mere fact of owning a bicycle or even having the knowledge of how to ride one doesn't necessarily mean you have the capability to ride a bicycle, because you also need, a functioning road infrastructure on which to ride your bicycle. Plus, you might need other things like a legal structure that actually permits the riding of bicycles. So it very nicely encapsulates both the individual and societal elements within this. The other thing about well-being is it's nicely spanning the collective and the individual. It goes from really how we feel about our lives, how satisfied we are with our lives, how happy we are even on an individual level, right the way through to very objective aspects related to collective well-being. So I think it's interesting that very often when we read about well-being in the media, there tends to be a focus more on the individual. This notion that it's somehow related to mental health or even yoga. But actually, it's very much rooted in the collective and the physical material factors that make up human society. covering everything from the basic requirements for survival right the way through to living lives of value. So what it means essentially to live healthy, happy, and sustainable lives, and enabling people to meet their physical, economic, environmental, social, mental, emotional, cultural, spiritual, all these things, aspirations. So I think in that sense, it's a very useful concept, since it is actually quite broad-ranging and it's got, you know, pretty much everything in it. The other thing that's interesting about it, and some yet more good news, is that frameworks exist. They're different, but they have broad similarities. And certainly looking at the international level, I think one of the most useful is that from the OECD, the Wellbeing Framework, which I'm showing you here, which, as you can see, has a number of dimensions related to well-being, which they divide up according to things called quality of life, and on the other hand, material conditions. What's interesting also at the bottom is that they highlight the 4 capitals that go into providing the resources for well-being, and in turn how well-being generates those resources for the future. So the natural capital, human, economic, and social capital. But very interesting with regard also to the discussions earlier this morning, is the extension of these types of capital stocks. There's very nice work being done in New Zealand by a friend of mine, Paul Dalyell, and his colleagues in Wellbeing Economics. This is a book that they produced, it came out about a year or so ago, where they're also talking about cultural capital, knowledge capital, and diplomatic capital. So it's very exciting also to see these ideas being picked up and used more also in the UK context, as was discussed earlier by Adela and Harry. In addition, there are many, many frameworks for it at national level. Here's the example for Germany. Or not least, the United Kingdom. Somewhat ironic, this one, in that it was introduced at virtually the same time as austerity. They need to assess the impacts of austerity. But, you know, it just goes to show that there are good precedents, and I think that there are things that we can be using and taking from this within the heritage sector in order to give a better framework and better language to how we actually start to quantify the benefits of preserving and maintaining heritage. The final thing I would like to talk about really is just the connections also between well-being and sustainability, because actually these two things I think are in fact not separate. I think they are inherently connected. In a sense, I would consider sustainability to be a little bit like the seed or the process by which well-being is generated, or in fact, well-being is the fruit of sustainability. And really, when thinking about it like that, I think also ultimately what we're talking about here is equity. I think well-being is very, very much connected with equity, and equity, I think, is a particularly key word for focus at this time, particularly in relation to COVID and how we go forwards out of this situation. And really, when we think about social, economic, and environmental equity, it's clear you can't have economic justice or environmental justice without social justice. And the interesting element here is also when you add sustainability into the mix, you introduce the notion, you sort of future-proof it. You introduce intergenerational equity. And I think this is, you know, just to show how really these concepts, I think, are inherently interlinked. And I think could be, you know, provide much more useful frameworks, certainly for those of us in the heritage sector, to be able to articulate the worth of cultural heritage for society, but not just that. I think it's also in terms of informing the heritage sector and ourselves also how can I say, re-realizing the aims of conserving heritage and why we do that, and indeed seeking ways in which we can do that more purposefully and more effectively. And I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.